Hello, welcome everybody. I'm so sorry for the couple-minute delay there. We were just wrapping up another research series round over the lunch hour here, and it ran a few minutes long. But I think we have both Simon and Anina on the line. Is that right? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Well done. Fantastic. Good, good, good. And have you been able to, do you have any slides you were planning on using? Is that already taken care of, or do we need to troubleshoot that at all?
Yeah, we are getting there, I think.
Okay. No worries at all. If I can help, just let me know.
Yeah.
And same thing, I'm sure, I think Nate, might be on the line there too. And we'll get started in just a second.
Okay.
But do you have any other kind of last minute questions aside from the slide?
No, we are trying with the slides, so then we know like how long is kind of a 30-minute presentation you mentioned. And then
yeah, no, feel free. I mean, if you need to take a bit longer than that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry for the feedback. But yeah, no, I'd say 30 to 45. It's nice to have at least kind of 10 to 15 minutes at the end for discussion and questions.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's it's also an interesting part for us to get feedback and have kind of an open discussion on the framework.
Excellent. Excellent. Oh, that sounds great. Well, good. Well, as soon as you guys feel comfortable and have everything good to go and pulled up, I'll be happy to make the introductions and we can take it from there.
Yes. I think Simon is still trying. If everybody's on the call already, we might just like first kind of introduce.
Sure. No, I'm happy to do that while we're still troubleshooting. Yep. Absolutely. No, that's no problem at all. Without further ado, then, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us in this next session of IU's Ethics, Values, and Technology series. We've covered a lot of ground already throughout this series. Professor up at Purdue, ethics with the government hacker. That was a great presentation and great discussion. You might remember just last week, we were able to feature Amanda Craig from Microsoft talking to us about, cyber norms. Val from the Cyber Future Society talking similarly about the future of cyber peace. A lot of wonderful ground. Today, we're focusing more on another core aspect of this series, and that is not only cyber ethics, but now cybersecurity and the intersection in particular with geopolitics and national security. And we're thrilled to be able to do that with two leading researchers affiliated with Harvard's Belfer Center. And they are Simon Jones. Good to see you, Simon. He is a technology and security professional. He's currently serving as the Director of Information Security and Compliance for Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. Simon's also a non-resident fellow with Belfer's Defending Digital Democracy Project. And has been very involved in the Cyber Power Index, which is the new report that we'll be featuring today. And then we're also very lucky to be joined by Anina Schwarzenbach, because she's a criminologist and postdoctoral associate at the University of Maryland Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and a fellow with Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center as well. And her work focuses on political violence. That was actually the topic of our research series right before this, so 'tis the season, and government responses, cyber powers and threats, policing, state legitimacy, and she's been a member of Belfer's cyber project team that has built the Cyber Power Index that was just recently released last month, and has also been the International Security Program postdoctoral fellow. So in other words, we have two very accomplished cybersecurity thought leaders with us, and we're thrilled to have you both. And very excited to hear about this report, your thoughts, and allow us to dig in, because there has been a few attempts over the years to define first and then gauge cyber power around the world. And this, I think, is a really compelling example about how to do that effectively. So thank you so much again for taking the time to join us today. And if you're good to go on your end, I'm happy to pass the baton.
Great, thank you so much. Look, thank you for inviting us. Really excited to be here. Let me share my screen and let's see if you can see this. Okay.
Perfect.
Perfect. All right, great. Well, look, thank you again for having us. I really appreciate it. So the National Cyber Power Index was, a product of about a year's worth of research, and really it started when we started to look at the kind of key question around, what is cyber power? We saw a lot of people talking about cyber power, and there seemed to be a kind of lack of consistency and lack of clarity about what actually cyber power amounted to, and quantitative and qualitative ways to really assess cyber power. So Anina and I, along with a team of fantastic co-authors, Julia, Irfan, Winona, and Dan, came together through the Belfer Center to really start to kind of wade into this and discuss the topic and try and bring some of that kind of rigor and focus to the topic. So you all will have seen these kind of quotes, which countries are cyber superpowers. You will have seen perhaps the same list of countries, US, China, Russia, Israel, UK. And again, not that we were trying to sort of critique or criticize our predecessors and those who tried to do it before, but we were struck very much by the observation that there was too much of a kind of focus on very eye-catching cyber attacks, or perhaps countries that talked a lot about cyber attacks and cyber capabilities. And we were worried that actually countries might be missed by this approach. And so that's why we tried to inject this kind of rigor and methodology to it. So in essence, the kind of traditional interpretation of cyber power, or what predecessors have typically tended to focus on, has been predominantly on capability focused. Again, those kind of eye-catching attacks, and again, offensive cyber capabilities as well. And we really felt that was not necessarily the right approach. And many of you will have seen the capability, intent, opportunity triangle. It's used a lot in counterterrorism. It's used a lot in cyber threat assessments. And we really start to think that perhaps that intent element, and to a slightly lesser extent that opportunity element, was really missing from that interpretation, and really missing from that analysis. And so that was one of the kind of key things we tried to focus on. What are these cyber powers trying to achieve, and how do they really bring that capability to bear to achieve it? And we were very aware that a lot of people talked about cyber in terms of conventional power, conventional military power, nuclear power, intelligence agency competition, and things like that. And we really start to feel that actually, whilst there is some sort of analogous focus, that analogy doesn't particularly carry across, because countries are using cyber in a very kind of distinct way. And really, I'll use kind of two analogies of the conventional military power to kind of show you some examples of this. Again, if you're only looking through the lens of capability, and if you're only looking through the lens of offensive capability, well, how can you make sure that actually you are addressing the right threats, and the country has the tools to achieve its goals? And from a kind of conventional military perspective, well, you could count all the tanks a country has, but if it has a large coastline, maybe it needs a navy. And likewise, if you are measuring only tanks and troops when you're counting kind of conventional military capability, you are not necessarily capturing the full picture of what a country does to defend itself, and also to give itself the tools to conduct espionage and things overseas and elsewhere. So again, we started to kind of think about this and think about what did that mean in analogy terms, and actually how were countries using cyber power. So the conclusion we drew was that cyber power is a mixture of intent and capability. It is the intent of a country to pursue national objectives using cyber means, and it is the demonstration that it has the capabilities to achieve those objectives. And so really focusing on those kind of two elements, we thought was really kind of trying to approach this from a very fresh and novel perspective. And the underlying subtext of this was that cyber is a tool in the toolkit of countries. It sits alongside, as I said, conventional military power. It sits alongside diplomacy, economic levers, and other things that has available to a country. But it is just one tool it uses to achieve its goals. Cyber objectives themselves may be unique, but what they are trying to achieve with them are not necessarily unique. And so we worked to find 8 different objectives that countries are looking to pursue through cyber means. And we assessed 7 of these in the research, or we measured 7 of them in the index: surveilling, monitoring domestic groups, enhancing national cyber defenses, defining international cyber norms and technical standards, foreign intelligence collection, destroying or disabling an adversary's infrastructure, growing national cyber and technical competence, and controlling and manipulating the information environment. So we assess those both in intent terms and in capability terms in the research. But there was an eighth one that we found that we struggled to assess, particularly from a capability side, which is amassing wealth and extracting cryptocurrency. And we hit across these 8 objectives based on a very comprehensive literature review. We looked at probably around 100 national cyber strategies, across a number of years, number of iterations that countries published them. We assessed about 1,000 government cyber websites or web pages. We looked a lot at private sector and kind of independent attribution of cyber attacks. Again, really to try and focus on what was that country trying to achieve and how did it use cyber to achieve that objective. And again, we really felt that that was a kind of key part of this, because that then allowed us to say, okay, this is the intent and this is what the country is trying to achieve. Now we can then focus on measuring the capability it brings to bear to achieve that. And really, we think this brings kind of 3 big benefits to policymakers, because many of us, in fact, all of us have some kind of policy background or national government background. Really it helps to broaden the assessment of cyber power. It makes it much more comprehensive. It breaks us out from the kind of defense, offense view of cyber power. Secondly, we think it's a useful tool for starting to look at cyber through the lens of cyber priorities and policy objectives. And again, why is someone deciding to invest in cyber capabilities versus, their diplomatic corps or their conventional military forces? And then finally, we think this is a year-on-year tool that you can really use to kind of measure and monitor different countries. By looking iteratively what countries are doing and how they're expressing their intent and whether or not they have the capability to do this. We thought this was something that we could be building across a number of different years and a number of different iterations of the NCPI. And that would give policymakers a really good insight into the international cyber power landscape. So I'll hand over to Anina to talk you through a bit more of the kind of detail of how we got here.
Yes, so I will dive into the way the cyber power was measured and combined together and walk you through some of the main results on both like the general aggregated levels. So that means the levels of the cyber power index, and then also look at the capabilities and intent. But first things first, let's start with how we constructed cyber power. To do this, as Simon mentioned, we have done like a literature review. We have also looked theoretically how power is defined, national power, and have taken kind of inspiration from there and thus came up with this definition of cyber power as a combination of capability and intent. And the way this formula reads, it's, as you see, it's a sum of capabilities and intent for each of the objectives that Simon mentioned before, and then we take the average sum of the score for each of those objectives, and we come up with this with the final ranking of cyber power. Next slide, please. Okay, so the question is. After we have our formula, our definition, we have our idea now. How does a country demonstrate intent, and what are its capabilities? So basically, how do we measure these 2 aspects that are like the core of our measure of cyber power? Next slide, please. And I will start by measuring intent. And what you see here is not to kind of afraid or not to scare the audience, but it's just like a snapshot basically of our grid we used to measure intent. So just to kind of show you that we had like we have like came up with a clear grid informed by the work mainly Simon and other colleagues have done and have come up with this grid that then we assess in ways I will show you now. Next slide, please. So basically what we have done is an analysis of cyber strategies mainly, and we have asked different questions. And these questions are reported in this grid that you see, that you have seen before. And if somebody wants to kind of have a closer look at all of this work, we have also a report that is published via the Belfer Center. So I encourage you to look that up in case, or a question at the end. But basically just to have like a more kind of a general idea how this was done is we have, for instance, asked how comprehensive is the country's cyber strategy? Does it include specific actions, owners and objectives? We have asked how long has the country had a cyber strategy for? How regularly has the country updated its cyber strategy? How recently has the country updated its strategy? And has the country announced increased cyber funding since it last published its strategy? And then we assess this through binary or like more granular indicators. And then this kind of was fed into a score at the end. But so we had like this clear kind of questions in mind that we have then, and we walked through each of this of the strategy by looking at these questions. Next slide, please. Just to have like a specific snapshot, I thought it would be maybe good to look at one of our objectives. So this is the example for surveillance, how we kind of scored the intent factors for surveillance. So because why I'm presenting this is because for each, since we had these different objectives, so for each objectives, we carefully looked at whether we could find kind of a notion whether this objective was addressed in the cyber strategies, and if so, to which extent, for instance. So this is then the more specific questions for each objectives that for surveillance would be, for instance, does the country have at least one policy or law enforcement agency with specialist cybercrime expertise, or that encourages citizens to report cybercrime? I pick another one. Is cybercrime, terrorism, or domestic surveillance via cyber means referred to within the country's domestic counterterrorism or homeland security strategy plan or law? And then the ones I mentioned before, the consistency of the objective and so on. So you see kind of basically a snapshot of the grid I mentioned at the very beginning. Next one, please. So kind of to wrap up the methodology for the intent part of our index, it was based mainly on a textual analysis of each country's cyber strategy. And we have then validated these findings also through the natural language processing part. Simon has done a lot of work on this, so I'm sure maybe he will then like add some insights on what I'm saying now, but I'm just giving you a broader overview. But feel free to kind of pose questions now or also at the end. Then like kind of this intent part is made up of 32 indicators, which are grouped under the 7 national objectives that we mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So surveillance, defense, control, intelligence, commerce, offense, and norms. And what we have done, so we have like looked at the demonstrated intent based on the strategies, but also the other part we have looked whether the stated intent, sorry, but we have also looked at the demonstrated intent. For instance, we're looking at cyber attacks that were carried out. So this was also information that we included in intent index. And the country's overall rating is the average of the 7 national objectives converted to a scale of 0 to 100%. Next one. So this was for the intent part. Now let's move on for the capabilities. And this is kind of structured in a similar way, just to show you how we have proceeded. This is a snapshot of the capability kind of matrix. And again, you will find much more detailed information on this in our report, in case you would be interested in it. So this is kind of gives you a list of the indicators mapped to the different objectives. And now I will walk you through this measure. Next. now the themes we have addressed here is, we have also looked at the attacks with a slightly different measure though. We have looked at national online content. We have looked at domestic state cyber structures. Also, we have looked at cyber vulnerabilities, at private sector trade and innovation measures, at connectivity measures, measures that assess workforce and legal and policy frameworks. And next. And now these kind of themes then translate in specific indicators, and I'm just mentioning a few. So there was a long list also for the capability indicators. It's, for instance, military cyber capabilities, cyber defense capabilities, cyber surveillance, human capacity, domestic policy, technical standards, and so on. The list goes on. Next, please. Now, the methodology for the capability part was different from the intent part, but because we have seen the intent was really heavily based on this assessment of the cyber strategies together with the assessment of the demonstrated intent. Whereas the capability part was relying on this set of indicators, and we have in the map that I've shown you in the snapshot, basically we have mapped these indicators to specific objectives, and these indicators are all indicators we have collected through either open source information, or some of the indicators we have also sourced them in-house because they were maybe more specific or missing for now. So kind of we have done this work as well. And the way then this kind of that kind of very more boring methodological part of this was done. So we have indicators that are on different scales and measure different objectives, and then we have first of all broke them on the same scale through min-max normalization technique. So that then every indicator we now consider ranges from 0, which means very low capability, to also 100%, which means very high capability. Now there are other techniques out there one could use with other pros and cons. So there's a lot of, also methodological work behind that. But then once we had like all these indicators on the same scale, we have then aggregated them together for per kind of objective. And this is maybe remembering the formula I showed you also at the beginning. And then we have taken the average across the 7 objectives. And just as a side note, so some indicators we have in our data set are important for multiple objectives. So therefore they are counted multiple times. And now next one, please. And now to the kind of more interesting part, to the results. And what I'm showing you here is a snapshot again of the National Cyber Power Score. So this is the result of all this work of kind of assessing and collecting information on intent and on capability and mapping them to the objectives, and then like multiplying them together and averaging, and then we end up with a score that ranges from 0, which would be very low cyber power, to 100, which would be very high cyber power. Now, you remember this is kind of, it's a result of a multiplication. And so therefore with this idea that Cyber mentioned also, like with this idea that capabilities alone don't kind of, are not enough for being a cyber power. You need to have the intent to really also leverage those capabilities. So therefore, if the intent is low, then kind of the capability score shrinks. This is the basic kind of idea behind what we are seeing here. And the results are that, next slide. Results are basically the main results are what you see summarized in this table. And this table is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it shows you on on the column overall score, you have the result of our Cyber Power Index. So this basically translated into score what you've seen in the graph before. But you also have a column capabilities and a column intent. And this shows you the ranking based on only like the capability index and only the intent index. So meaning that we have, with our measure, we have provided an overall score of cyber power, but we have also provided 2 additional measures, one looking at cyber capability and one looking at intent, and therefore allowing countries also kind of to navigate their strengths and weaknesses in both of these domains. And so the results show you the first 10, like the top 10 cyber powers according to our measure and our index result to be for the year 2020 will result to be United States, China, the UK, Russia, Netherlands, France, Germany, Canada, Japan, and Australia. But I want to draw your attention, for instance, if we pick Australia, which is number 10 overall, you see the capability, Australia ranks pretty low, whereas intent, it's much higher up. So this kind of gives you an indication, as I said before, where kind of one might want to look at and one might want to build strength. And this is in line with what Simon also has mentioned, that we really wanted to provide a measure that is also useful both for practitioners that want to have like more specific information and also, but also for researchers that want to dig into this aspect in more detail. So we are really careful. It was very important to us that we provide a measure that allows a high level of disaggregation. Next one. And this is the graph showing the ranking by intent. So this is kind of basically now moving back to the visualization of the results. It's kind of what we have seen just in the table before, but extended to all of the countries in our data set. And you see here all the countries and their score for intent. And it's scored, and you see also that it's split up by the different objectives. So they are listed in the legend on the right. And what is interesting here is just also to see at what point some objectives are more or less important for specific country. So this is just like a first hint, to then carry out further analysis, basically. Next. And this is the ranking, if we now look at the ranking by intent for the specific objectives. Here we have the top 10 listed for the objectives that by now we know. So like, as I mentioned, surveillance, defense, control, intelligence, commercial, offense, and norms. And you see how much variation there is for most of the countries where they are kind of ranked in the different objectives. That also tells you basically that combining all of that, all of these different objectives in one measure, by doing that, you lose a lot of information. So it's very important and interesting to have at hand a measure whereby you can look really where the strength of the countries are in these specific objectives. Next. We move now on to the capability side of the story, and here is the final capability score. So combining all the 7 objectives for the country we have assessed, and you see that if you have a closer look, you will see that although the top 10 are more or less stable, you still see that there are some jumps in the country. If you then like assess capability together with intent, this ranking changes basically. Next. And you see also here, this is also just to show you how kind of consistent we were in our assessment and our methodology. we have here the ranking by capability, the top 10 along the 7 objectives. And yeah, differently from before, now we look at capability and not intent. But the same idea behind is true also here, that we provided a measure whereby you really can assess these different capabilities together with the same strength. I think, as I mentioned before, that like just combining all of that together, you kind of will lose this variation in the rankings across the countries. Next. I want to kind of wrap up this part by focusing quickly on the capability side and on 2 spotlights that I want to mention. So first, if we look at national cyber defense, it's not like not here in this presentation, but if you will look at the report, you will see that a lot of countries rank quite highly. So there is also the question kind of how we came up with this score, what kind of what underlies all of these objectives in specific, looking at specific indicators. And so I just kind of want to give you a bit of a hint how this was done. So for national cyber defense, we had 10 indicators, and among others, there were cybersecurity laws, top cybersecurity firms, computer and mobile infection rates, vulnerabilities, cybersecurity response team, mobile and broadband speed. And some of those are positively related to the capabilities of national cyber defense, and others are negatively related. So this is kind of how they were included in our index. And I think this kind of list shows you shows you that a bit the duality, and it becomes even more evident if you look at specific countries. So the USA, for instance, ranks very high on vulnerabilities affecting domestic machines, which is kind of included negatively in the index, as well as on top cybersecurity firms, which is positive. So you see that there is kind of, it levels out a bit to a certain point because you have both these positive and negative indicators. Next one. And then spotlight Israel, maybe then Simon wants to expand on that at the end as well. I think I just also want to mention this because it's a question we get a lot. So you might have missed Israel from the top 10 cyber powers in the ranking I've presented at the very beginning. And this is, if you have missed it, it's true, because it's not in the top 10, it's ranked 14, number 14 for the National Cyber Power Index 2020. And it's ranked, if you look at the capabilities that are mostly kind of connected, that are generally kind of connected with cyber power or the offense part that are usually like discussed together in the literature, you will see that Israel is ranked number 12. Now this is kind of in lower, as some expert would have assessed it. And I just kind of want to give like a couple of explanation of why this is the case, and then we might want to discuss this further on in the discussion section. So first of all, since we have provided this measure that is so disaggregated, we can look at what kind of indicators went in this assessment of Israel. So you have the Cyber Command indicator, where Israel is not like ranked at the highest. So because it's there are more kind of sophisticated cyber commands. We have the high-tech exports, where also other countries are ranked higher than Israel. The military staffing, where other countries have a larger number of staffing than Israel. So this is kind of how this indicator came to be together. Obviously, there are also shortcomings which Simon will address later on as well, more generally. But you see those in this indicator. We have based our index on open source data for specific reasons, but this has obviously also some limitations. So therefore, we kind of we consider more quantitative than qualitative aspects for this capability assessment specifically. This is kind of less true for the intent part, but next one, please. And I kind of want to finish by showing you this map. And this is another way how we can look at our index, or how others can and have looked at our index, and how kind of the usefulness of it is, I think, is depicted a bit in this graph, because what this graph shows you is on the x-axis, we have the cyber capability index, and on the epsilon, the cyber intent, and they are mapped one against each other. So we end up with 4 quadrants with very, on the left high up corner, we have lower capability and higher intent. And we have kind of a cluster of countries that fall into this basket, basically. So you have Russia, Netherlands, Canada, Israel, Australia, and so on this part. Then on the upper level, but on the right part of the quadrant, you will see kind of the country that have both high capabilities, but also high intent. And this is the US, China, the UK, France, and Germany. And this is kind of very interesting to see where they are positioned in this map. And then we have the largest part of the countries we have assessed that fall into lower capabilities and lower intent. Although you see with this map, there is variation across the countries. So you would see that there is kind of a move toward the middle ground, or a move toward the higher quadrants. Therefore, it's very likely that in our next assessment, this kind of map will change a bit. And on the lower level, on the right hand, you have the higher capability and lower intent, and this is true for very few countries, kind of having this combination together. So we only have South Korea and Singapore, kind of, and others that maybe touch it a bit, but yes. So this is kind of another way how we can look at our index, and another way that I think helps also to understand the work we have done, and kind of the usefulness of it as well. So I will now hand it over again to Simon to finish up.
Great, thank you, Anina. So, I mean, Anina touched on a lot of this, but we are very aware of the limitations of doing this. But we still felt it was a useful exercise to do, because we felt it was a good way to be, as we said, kind of challenging some of that kind of conventional thinking around cyber, and to try and make this a very data-led exercise. But although we cherry-picked the 30 countries, we selected the 30 countries we felt should be included on this list. It was difficult to find data that was consistent across all 30 countries. For that matter, I mean, really, we were able to find common indicators across 29 countries, the exception being DPRK. And that was, we thought that was an appropriate and acceptable approach, and we used some expert analysis to kind of help us score DPRK. But it did mean that, some very interesting data sets we had used that we felt would have been very insightful, perhaps we couldn't use because they just weren't common across all 29 of the remaining countries. We're also aware that, national cyber power is just one way that countries, are competitive in cyberspace. We do know countries use proxies, they use hackers for hire, they use national groups within their borders. Again, we just wanted that golden thread all the way from the kind of national, domestic and foreign policy through to a cyber objective, through to how the country itself tries to employ that cyber effect or capability. But we do realize, this does narrow and preclude us from seeing some of the activity countries do still, undertake in cyberspace. As Anina mentioned, we know there are some simplifications. Again, some of those metrics we use, we know they are good, but they're not necessarily excellent indicators of, some of our objectives and some of the capabilities we're measuring. And so that is, we're very aware is something we'd look to challenge and think about in future iterations of the NCPI. And finally, you know, we're very aware that we are capturing the duality of cyber capabilities. I mean, you know, as Anina demonstrated there very well, you know, some capabilities that in one objective is a positive indicator and in another one is a negative indicator. For example, social media use. And, you know, again, that does mean that there is a risk that, you know, using one of those common data sets does inject, you know, kind of greater risk that was skewing our results or sort of not giving them, you know, the kind of fair analysis we were expecting to focus on. But just kind of final slide and as a wrap up, I mean, again, we really want this to be useful for policymakers. And so our approach is basically recommending a kind of 4-step approach for policymakers. You know, how do you break out from the current very stovepiped view of cyber? You know, how do you try and challenge and kind of take a more comprehensive approach? And really, first stage is break beyond, you know, cyber offense and defense, attack and defense. You know, that is not how most countries are seeing cyber capability or how they're employing cyber capability. So we really want them to try and think about that and actually stop thinking about that kind of that just in offense and defense terms, because it is so much more comprehensive. And actually there's a risk that countries, you know, self-deter themselves if they are thinking only in those terms. And secondly, thinking about the priorities of other countries. You know, again, we throw up some really interesting results about how there is a lot of competition between the US, China, Russia on things like controlling the information space. And, you know, in the midst of an election campaign and a combination of election campaign, you know, we are seeing that manifest. So understanding the priorities and objectives of other countries, both allies and adversaries, is an important thing that this research shows, and it should be something that countries are factoring in. And then thirdly, you know, developing a comprehensive cyber vision. We saw a lot of strategies that were very well written, you know, very comprehensive, but they only covered one aspect of a country's cyber policy. And their Ministry of Foreign Affairs would have one document, and then their, you know, Department of the Prime Minister or President would have another, and their Ministry of Defense would have another. You know, really we're recommending you produce common and consistent policy across all of these different organizations that really try and capture and consolidate all these different cyber policies and strategies into a single document that the entire system of government buys into. And then finally, put money in the right places. And again, it's not about spending more money, but it's about thinking more strategically about cyber.
Oh, we might have lost you, Simon. Can you still hear us okay? Could be a dramatic pause, but there might be a connection issue.
Yeah, there is a connection issue.
Indeed. I think I knew where he was headed, though. Oh, no, you're back, Simon.
Oh, did you lose me?
We did, just for maybe just the last 30 seconds.
Okay, correct. So like I said, put money in the right places, you know, spend money smarter. It doesn't necessarily mean more. That's the final conclusion of that point. So that's the conclusion of our presentation. We'd be delighted to take any questions and comments you have.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. And I know everyone is joining me in a virtual round of applause because it's very much a tour de force. These projects are notoriously difficult. So frankly, I applaud you for just taking it on in the first place as well. I did have a few questions myself, but just as a reminder to the attendees and the students in particular, feel free to use the Q&A feature to pose your own questions to Simon and Anina, and we will get to those as well. It looks like we do have. Oh, good. Let's start with those from the box, because I'm happy to pose mine as well, but I want to make sure we get to those from the audience first. So one of the questions, you guys can see it as well, is how is the commerce objective defined, or what are the indicators of commerce? Did the indicators show true, you know, for all 30 countries? And what about supply chain partnerships? Do they play a role in this area? So maybe that's in reference to some tighter supply chains, perhaps across NATO, et cetera. So there's kind of a series of questions there, but feel free to respond to any of those that you guys would like.
Sure, I'll start and then Anina can jump in. So yeah, I mean, all of the objectives we outlined had both kind of offensive components and, you know, defensive, if you're thinking in that kind of offense defense line. So the commerce objective was both everything from commercial espionage. So, you know, thinking about some perhaps Chinese activity, stealing F-35 plans and, you know, kind of commercial IP, but it was also building your cyber export industry as well. You know, building your ability to sell cyber products elsewhere and kind of creating, that sort of burgeoning cyber economy within your own country. So and for all of these, we try to avoid any kind of pejorative label with the objective. Information control, likewise, is both everything from spreading propaganda and misinformation through to tackling propaganda and boosting privacy. So we did try and make it so, countries shouldn't feel labeled by achieving or pursuing one or more of these objectives. And to the question around supply chains, I mean, yeah, we saw this as a kind of key part of that. And that was one of the indicators we did look for. Were countries trying to protect their own cyber supply chain and, think about who their suppliers were and recommend, ways that the industries could protect themselves as part of the commercial objective.
Anything you wanted to add, Anina, or are you?
No, it's kind of, just like kind of reiterating a bit. So we looked on the capabilities side, we just thinking about kind of standard indicators also you would use to measure commerce. So we looked, for instance, at human capital, but we looked also at the tech exports, we looked at patent application, and a number of more. So it's kind of hard to remember all of those, but in our report today, by the way, I've just like posted the link. So there is like all the detailed information on that part.
Thank you. No, I should have done that at the beginning. So thank you for doing that. And Jane was also asking about measuring national vulnerabilities. And she kind of references in particular their concerns around numbers, types of devices. So perhaps, IoT vulnerabilities. And as you mentioned, maybe the applicable laws and policies could have some impact on that if there's, more robust standards for reasonable cybersecurity for internet connected devices, et cetera. Did you guys take into account those types of issues? Those are also quite tough, I know.
Yeah, we used Showdown data. The only kind of proprietary data set we used was Showdown data. We only took a relatively small snapshot, again, to make sure we could find the same devices across the same countries. But we looked at things like, heartbleed vulnerabilities. We looked at different types of kind of web infrastructure and, the quantity in a country, how well it was supported, so if people are still using XP machines, they scored down, these kind of things. So we did start to try and look about those kind of vulnerabilities and what could be assessed through those kind of approaches. Yeah, so that was one area. And I'd like, certainly in future iterations, using that kind of more comprehensively would be good. Nina, do you recall what else we used in terms of other kind of metrics?
No, so that was kind of the principal metrics on that side. We looked also at content removal requests from Google, and so this was another metric we have assessed. These are, by the way, these are kind of the less traditional measures we have used, and I think this is also very interesting and important because once kind of you start to look at trying to define first of all, but also then trying to measure, you cannot only really rely on kind of the traditional ones, but you have to come up with more creative ways. So these were kind of the more creative ways. We have come up with this measure, meaning, although also kind of there is always a limitation coming with that as well, that we will need future iterations and assessment to kind of to improve the measurements basically as well. So
absolutely. No, it's an ongoing process, that's for sure. I was involved a little bit myself in the ITU Global Cyber Index when that was first launched. And I'm remembering vaguely their effort to kind of crowdsource that, basically, to kind of send out these spreadsheets where experts could help kind of rank how much, relative weight to give to various dimensions along these lines. And I'm just wondering offhand, did you guys, as you were developing this methodology, have a little bit of a similar approach? Were you kind of canvassing opinions, or were you trying mostly to look to see what had been done before, right, and see any obvious, changes, maybe blind spots, as you kind of pointed out here, and take those on, knowing that it's an iterative process, right, and there's always an opportunity to go back and try this again too. So was that mostly in-house, or was it kind of a big tent approach?
Simon then might want to expand on that, but I think like really the idea or core of the project was at first that these kind of measures that were out there were not like sufficient in a sense in showing cyber power. So relying, for instance, on expert assessment, which is very important, but is not enough, and there's a lot of bias that can come with it. So I think the initial idea was also to really take a radical new approach to the topic, relying in a first iteration, let's say, like relying heavily on open source data and considering expert assessments more as a validation tool. And there are always pros and cons with all of these methods and approaches, but I think really that allowed us at least to broaden up the spectrum. And the ITU, as far as I'm familiar with it, face these challenges of like heavily kind of changes in the ranking due to this specific expert assessment. So I kind of wanted to avoid going down this road. So, but maybe Simon has additions to that.
Well, I mean, we were aware of the great work that others had done on this, you know, and doing the kind of expert-led model is a great way to focus. But we like the idea of trying to make, you know, bring that quantitative element to it. We thought was really important. And you know, again, a lot of it was about that, bringing that focus, you know, assessing the objective and then making sure the metric and indicator, you know, demonstrated that capability intent was really our kind of primary focus.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, you in the report we have also a graph kind of mapping the two indexes together. So kind of reiterating a bit what Simon said, is also we kind of wanted to expand and build up. That doesn't mean that this measure can also be and should also be compared to each other and maybe used in conjunction with each other. So yeah, and that's on page 8 for those keeping track, which is, yeah, it's very helpful to see that side by side and telling and interesting, right? Because as you said, they're kind of measuring different elements of cybersecurity here and there. But I love it. I mean, Netherlands, number 5, fantastic. I'm wondering, as you guys were going through this process, were there any real surprises that cropped up for you? Israel was on my list, so thank you for already, you know, dealing with that, Anina. But were there others that you were ranked much more highly or much more lowly than you expected kind of coming into this project, which is always part of the fun?
I mean, I think because we were trying to be so kind of novel, you know, and again that brings risks and opportunity. I wouldn't say there's nothing felt kind of too out of bounds. You know, we knew people would comment on Israel. You know, the Dutch have been interested in their score. The Australians have used it. You know, it's become a kind of policy debate in Australia a little bit around, you know, intent versus capability and what the current administration is doing on cyber terms. So that was there. We were aware, you know, as we are, there are a lot of Brits in this. You know, the British do tend to score very highly in intent terms and fairly well up the rankings. You know, again, we feel we played it pretty straight with this, but you know, we were, you know, that was something that certainly attracted a little bit of attention, but nothing kind of so out of the bounds. I mean, Israel is the one that again has kind of raised a little bit of policy debate, but in intent terms, you know, Israel is actually relatively high, and you know, Anina otherwise pulled out good stats on where Israel scores. So.
No, thank you. And we're running short on time, so just a reminder for last questions, feel free to submit those. One that just came in was, you mentioned that you use publicly available data to generate the Cyber Power Index. Any concerns that, here you go, was there any propaganda? Because, you know, perhaps even in the cybersecurity strategies themselves, since they're just, you know, high-level strategic documents, right? They're not necessarily domestic policy, or even, I'm not sure, but this anonymous attendee could be referring to other types of, you know, information that could have been, you know, used to skew any of the data. Did you guys have any, I'm sure you did, safeguards to ensure, you know, accuracy along the way?
So, I mean, what we were looking for when we were doing that assessment of intent was, you know, what is a country trying to say, you know, to its national population, to the international community? And so, you know, arguably it was more a question of what people were not saying in the cyber realm. You know, we know that, for example, Russia was slightly kind of, you know, the language it tends to use about how it describes its offensive capability and its kind of destructive capability is not the same as Western countries tend to focus on. So, you know, it was more a question of countries being kind of elusive in what they were saying. But again, you know, when we were measuring intent, we used both the textual analysis. We then also use things like, you know, participation in military exercises. Well, that is a good sign you're going for destructive capability if you're practicing, you know, turning off someone's power grid. And ultimately, you know, we used attributed attacks as both, you know, a metric of intent. You know, if you've demonstrated your intent to the point you've actually pulled the trigger, you are definitely pursuing an objective. So we really feel across the course of the different indicators we gathered, that helped to bring, you know, an element of kind of consistency and clarity.
Yeah, and we have also had already rounds of discussion with experts in assessing our measure and kind of collecting also feedback on what we might have omitted, and so kind of we are have validated it already and are continuing to do so with also this tool, which is kind of, I think, very important for this type of work.
No, excellent, yeah. And we're pretty much out of time, but I want to make sure to get to Hal's question, and then so maybe we'll do like a very, very short lightning round here. So Hal in particular was asking about the different kind of foreign policy strategies and approaches, particularly from the US and China in this way, with China being a little more focused on, you know, bending the curve to its long-term strategic advantage. And he was wondering, are these two foreign policy styles and approaches reflected in your rankings? You mentioned cyber norms, for example. Perhaps they're reflected there to an extent?
Yeah, I mean, that was an active area of competition. You know, we saw the information space as a key area. You know, Russia, China, US were, I think, respectively 1, 2, and 3 in their intent in that space. So I will continue to be a kind of domain of competition. But, you know, it shows opportunities where countries can perhaps challenge. You know, surveillance was a high priority for Russia and China. Well, if the US and Western powers, you know, want to compete in cyberspace, perhaps, you know, encourage firms not to sell surveillance technology to, you know, to these countries. So it offers a good way to kind of, you know, approach in a more
Oh, that's fantastic. We might have lost you again, Simon. I'm so sorry.
There was another question, if not, I think in the chat box.
Oh, yeah.
Who is the target customer for this report? I might kind of just jump in on that.
Sure,
or Simon, are you back?
Ahead. Yeah, that's fine.
Simon, we lost you.
I've been there.
I don't. Okay, basically, I mean, Simon has already kind of addressed this, I think, in kind of his final wrap up a bit. We have multiple audiences, hopefully, for this. So obviously the governments themselves and cyber experts that are interested in that, and kind of we want to provide them a tool and also kind of continue to do this work so that this can be monitored and assessed in the future as well. But eventually also we want to kind of broaden the discussion in academia as well, that had a very narrow focus on cyber power for now. So kind of we want to provide at least like the first step in broadening that, hoping that kind of this will also invigorate the discussion there and maybe result in a broader understanding of this concept. And I think this is, I hope this work was useful also for that part. So different audiences.
Absolutely. And no, very, very much so. And very, very last kind of quick final thought, any plans for an update in a year or two? Is this going to be an ongoing process, or are you guys approaching this as a kind of a one-off exercise for the time being?
Okay. It's no, we are definitely considering to continue with that. So like considering to kind of move on to the next round of data collection. So what, and maybe this is also, you know, we are kind of, this is a open process, and you are very keen to discuss this. So if anybody has like ideas also on data specifically, which I think the framework is in place, so we will want to keep that. But like obviously the index is as good as the data we can collect for it. So if you have any idea on kind of other or better data, once you maybe have had a look at it, so we very welcome any kind of suggestions on that project. I might just also, I don't know if our emails are already shared, but I can quickly do that.
Oh, sure. No, that'd be great if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Well, I'm glad to hear it because I think it'd be great to continue this. And I'm so glad you guys are focusing on the cybersecurity strategies. They're such useful documents, and I don't feel like they get the play they deserve. We're doing something similar now with AI, just national, strategies, which has been kind of an interesting exercise anyway. So thank you so much. I know we're unfortunately a few minutes over time already, but I really, really appreciate you guys taking time out of your busy schedules to highlight this important work. And thanks again to everybody for joining. And one last virtual round of applause for both Anina and Simon. Much appreciated, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks again. Be safe. Have a wonderful rest of your days. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.